Fall has always been my favorite time of year. There's something about the crisp air, the way the leaves turn brilliant shades of orange and red, and the sense of calm that comes with the changing season. Every year, I make it a point to take a long hike in the woods near my house. It's quiet out there, peaceful, or at least it used to be. Last October, I decided to do my annual hike a little later than usual. It was mid-October, just after a big cold front had rolled through and the leaves were at their peak. I had the day off, so I packed a small bag with water, snacks, and my camera, and set out to explore some new trails I hadn't been on before. The woods were stunning, miles of trees shedding their leaves, the ground covered in a thick carpet of reds and yellows. The wind was light, rustling the branches above, and the air was so cold it stung my lungs. I had my headphones in, listening to some music, and for the first couple of hours everything was perfect. But as the afternoon wore on, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I hadn't seen another person all day, which was pretty typical for this time of year. Most people were already getting ready for Halloween or staying inside where it was warm. But still, there was something about the growing darkness that started to make me feel uneasy. At one point, I stopped to take a few photos of a particularly beautiful grove of trees, and that's when I noticed something strange. Off in the distance, maybe 100 yards away, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was a man, tall, with a dark jacket, standing perfectly still. He wasn't moving, just watching. I tried to ignore it at first, thinking maybe he was another hiker or a hunter, but something about the way he stood there made me feel unsettled. I took out my headphones, and the silence that followed was overwhelming. I could hear my own breathing, the crunch of leaves under my boots as I shifted my weight, but no sounds were coming from him. I gave a small wave, trying to be friendly, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring. I couldn't make out his face from that distance, but the way his head was tilted, it felt like he was watching me too closely. I figured it was time to move on, so I slung my camera over my shoulder and started walking down the path again. As I rounded a bend, I glanced back, and my heart skipped a beat. He was gone. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the creeping feeling of dread that had settled over me. The woods suddenly felt too quiet, like all the natural sounds, the birds, the rustling leaves, had disappeared, leaving me alone with the crunch of my own footsteps. I told myself I was just being paranoid. There was no reason to think anything was wrong, but every few minutes I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. And then I did. About half an hour later, I came to a small clearing near a creek. I stopped to catch my breath, my nerves starting to fray. I was just about to take a drink from my water bottle when I saw him again. This time, much closer. He was standing on the opposite side of the creek, maybe 20 feet away. He hadn't made a sound. I hadn't even heard him approach. He was just there, staring at me with that same blank expression. "Hey!" I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "You all right, man?" He didn't respond, didn't even blink, just stood there, his arms hanging limp at his sides. I felt a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. "I don't know what your deal is, but you're starting to freak me out," I said, taking a step back. Still nothing. He just stood there, completely motionless. I decided it was time to get the hell out of there. I turned and started walking quickly back the way I came, not daring to look back. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my neck despite the cold air. I thought I was putting distance between us, but the feeling that he was close, too close, wouldn't go away. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I expected to see him behind me, stepping out from behind a tree, his blank face still following me. And then, after what felt like hours of walking, I heard it, the sound of leaves crunching behind me. Slowly, methodically, I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence, afraid to turn around. But eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the trees. He was gone. No one was there. I started running. I don't know how long I ran. The path blurred beneath me, my legs burning with every step, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, desperate to put as much distance between myself and whatever or whoever was following me. When I finally reached the trailhead, I collapsed against my car, gasping for air. The parking lot was empty, no one around. I fumbled with my keys, hands trembling, and jumped into the car, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there at the edge of the trees watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty woods. I haven't been back to that trail since. I haven't gone hiking at all, really. The thought of being out there alone in the woods makes my skin crawl. And every time I see the leaves change, turning that beautiful shade of red, I think about the man in the woods, standing there, watching, waiting. There's something special about fall in the mountains, the cool air, the vibrant reds and oranges of the leaves, the way everything smells like pine and earth. It's a time when I always try to get away, take a break from the stress of work, and just reset. Last year I thought I'd found the perfect spot, a secluded cabin I found online, nestled in a quiet corner of the woods. The pictures looked perfect and the reviews were glowing. It was just what I needed. I booked the cabin for a long weekend in mid-October, right when the leaves were at their peak. The drive up was beautiful, long winding roads through forests of gold and crimson, with barely another car in sight. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the trees, and the air was crisp but not too cold. It was exactly how I'd pictured it. The cabin itself was small but cozy, just one bedroom, a kitchen, and a little porch that looked out over the woods. It was the kind of place where you could sit for hours, listening to the wind rustling through the leaves, with nothing but nature around you. No cell service, no neighbors, no distractions. I unpacked my things, made myself some tea, and settled in for a quiet evening by the fire. That first night was perfect. I curled up on the couch with a book, the only sounds coming from the crackling fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. By the time I went to bed, I felt more relaxed than I had in months, but things started to feel off the next day. I woke up early to the sound of something tapping on the window. At first I thought it was a bird or maybe just the wind blowing branches against the glass. But when I looked outside, I didn't see anything, just the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. I brushed it off and made breakfast, but that uneasy feeling lingered. After breakfast, I decided to take a walk through the woods. There was a trail that wound its way through the trees, and I figured it would be the perfect way to spend the morning. The path was quiet, the air filled with the smell of damp leaves, and the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows on the ground. About an hour into my walk, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, faint but definitely there. They didn't look fresh, but they weren't mine, and they weren't part of the trail. They led off into the woods, disappearing between the trees. I stopped, staring at the footprints, trying to figure out if someone else had been out here recently. It was supposed to be a secluded area, and I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. For a moment I considered following them, but something about the way they cut through the woods away from the trail made my stomach twist with unease. I decided to head back to the cabin instead. The rest of the day was quiet, but that feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me. I kept glancing out the windows, expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, but there was never anyone there. By the time the sun began to set, I was starting to feel paranoid, jumping at every little noise outside. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the middle of the woods. It was natural to feel a little uneasy. But then, just as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. That tapping on the window. It was louder this time, more deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding, and slowly turned toward the window. The cabin was small, and the windows weren't far from where I stood, but the curtains were drawn. I could feel my pulse in my ears as I moved closer, my breath coming in short, shaky bursts. I pulled the curtain back, just a crack, and peered outside. There was nothing, just the darkness of the woods, the faint outline of trees swaying in the breeze. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself, and closed the curtain again. But as soon as I did, I heard it. A faint, muffled laugh. It wasn't coming from the window, it was coming from the woods. I backed away from the window, my stomach twisting with fear. There shouldn't have been anyone out there. I was miles from the nearest house, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, my hands shaking as I sat down on the couch, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to leave, to get in my car and drive away, but it was late, and the road leading back to town was long and winding. I stayed up most of the night listening. Every once in a while I'd hear something, a twig snapping, leaves crunching, but nothing ever came close to the cabin again. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and decided to leave a day early. As I was loading my car, I glanced back at the cabin, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible between the branches, was the figure of a man. He was standing there, motionless, watching me. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I got in my car and drove away as fast as I could, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I was back in town, the safety of streetlights and people making me feel like I could finally breathe again. I've thought about that weekend a lot since then, trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was just some local messing with me, someone who knew I was staying there alone. But there was something about the way he stood there just watching that felt wrong. I haven't been back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. And every time the leaves start to change and the air gets cold, I remember that feeling of being watched and the sound of that laughter drifting through the trees. My family has always been big on traditions, and one of our longest standing ones is the annual fall getaway. Every October, we'd rent a cabin out in the country where the leaves turn gold and red and the air smells like wood smoke and pine. It's a quiet escape from the city, a time to unwind, spend time together, and enjoy the beauty of fall. But last year, something happened during that trip that I still can't explain. Something that changed the way I look at the people closest to me. It was supposed to be a typical fall weekend. We rented a cabin upstate, the same one we'd been to before, and packed up the car with warm clothes, board games, and enough food to last us 3 days. There was me, my older brother Ethan, my mom, and my dad. We'd done this trip so many times, it felt like second nature. The drive up was uneventful, just miles of winding roads through small towns, the trees lining the highway already turning shades of orange and red. We arrived in the late afternoon, and the cabin was just as I remembered it, rustic, with a large porch overlooking the woods, and that unmistakable smell of old wood and earth. It was isolated, but that was part of the appeal. There were no neighbors for miles, no cell service, just the 4 of us and the wilderness. That first night was perfect. We ate a big family dinner, played cards by the fire, and went to bed early, ready to spend the next few days hiking and exploring. I fell asleep to the sound of wind rustling through the trees outside, and for the first time in months, I felt truly relaxed. But things started to get strange the next morning. We'd planned to go for a hike after breakfast, so we all bundled up and headed out toward one of the nearby trails. The path was quiet, with only the occasional bird call breaking the silence, and the ground was covered in a thick carpet of fallen leaves. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. About an hour into the hike, we came across something odd. It was a clearing hidden deep in the woods, and in the center of it was a small, weathered cabin. We hadn't noticed it on any of our previous trips, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it shouldn't have been there. The place looked abandoned, its windows broken, the door slightly ajar, and the roof sagging in the middle. My dad, ever the adventurer, suggested we check it out. I hesitated. Something about that place felt wrong, but Ethan and my parents were already heading toward it, curiosity getting the better of them, so I followed. As we approached, I noticed something even stranger. The clearing was littered with broken toys, dolls with missing limbs, toy cars rusted and buried in the dirt. They looked old, like they'd been there for years, forgotten and left to rot. The closer we got to the cabin, the more of them we saw scattered across the ground. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice low. My dad shrugged, pushing open the cabin door with a creak. Inside, it was empty, just a single room with rotting floorboards and an old iron stove in the corner. But the air inside felt heavy, like it was thick with dust, even though the wind outside was howling. Ethan walked over to the stove, kneeling to look inside. Nothing here. It's probably been abandoned for years. We poked around for a few more minutes, but there wasn't much to see. The whole place felt wrong, like it was frozen in time, left untouched by anyone who passed through. After a while, we decided to head back to our cabin. That's when things really started to feel off. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My mum and dad didn't seem to notice, but Ethan was quieter than usual, barely saying a word after we got back from the hike. I asked him if something was bothering him, but he just shrugged me off, saying he was tired. That night, as we sat by the fire, I couldn't help but glance out the window. The wind had picked up, and the trees outside were swaying, their branches scraping against the cabin. For some reason, I felt like we weren't alone, like something was out there watching us. I tried to shake the feeling, but it only grew stronger. The more I looked at Ethan, the more I noticed how strange he was acting. His eyes seemed distant, almost glazed over, and he kept glancing toward the windows like he was expecting something. When I asked him what was going on, he snapped at me, something he never did. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was my parents, but when I listened closely, I realized the footsteps weren't inside, they were outside, circling the cabin. The sound was faint but steady, crunching through the fallen leaves. I lay there, frozen in my bed, straining to hear more, but after a few minutes the footsteps stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning I asked my parents if they'd heard anything, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just a deer or some animal passing through. But I knew what I'd heard, and I could tell by the look on Ethan's face that he had heard it too. He barely touched his breakfast, his hands shaking slightly as he picked at his food. That day, I decided to take a walk by myself, needing to clear my head. As I wandered through the woods, my thoughts kept drifting back to that abandoned cabin, the broken toys, and the eerie quiet that had settled over us. I walked for a while, trying to lose myself in the beauty of the fall colors, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got back to our cabin, I found my dad standing on the porch looking out into the woods with a strange expression. Before I could ask him what was going on, I noticed something on the ground, small, muddy footprints leading from the edge of the trees right up to our porch. They weren't animal tracks. They looked like children's footprints. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach as I followed the tracks with my eyes, but they disappeared as quickly as they'd appeared, vanishing into the leaves. I asked my dad if he'd seen them, but he just shook his head, his face pale. "It's nothing," he said, his voice tight. "Let's not talk about it." We left the cabin early the next morning, cutting our trip short. None of us talked about what had happened, but I knew we all felt it. That creeping sense of dread that had settled over us after we found that clearing. It's been a year since that trip, and we haven't gone back. Every fall when the leaves start to change, I think about those muddy footprints and the way Ethan's eyes glazed over after we visited that cabin. Something happened to us in those woods. Something we'll never talk about, but I can still feel it. I've always loved the fall season. There's something about the crisp air, the smell of wood smoke in the distance, and the way the leaves seem to glow in the late afternoon light. It's my favorite time of year, the perfect mix of cozy and eerie, especially as Halloween approaches. But after what happened last fall, the feeling of comfort I used to get from those cool, quiet nights has turned into something darker. It was a Friday night in early October, and I had the house to myself. My parents were away for the weekend, visiting my grandparents, and my younger brother was staying over at a friend's house. I didn't mind being alone. If anything, I was looking forward to it. A night of relaxation, watching old horror movies, with nothing but the sound of leaves rustling outside and a cup of hot cider in my hand. The day had been overcast, and by the time evening rolled around, the sky was dark and heavy with clouds. There was no wind, just an eerie stillness that made everything feel a little too quiet. I turned on the porch light and settled in on the couch with a blanket, my favorite movie playing on the screen, and the comforting glow of the fireplace filling the room. I was halfway through my movie when I heard it, a knock at the door. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a soft tap, just loud enough to get my attention, but not enough to make me jump. I paused the movie and listened, wondering if maybe it had been the wind or my imagination. But then it came again. 3 soft knocks, deliberate, like someone was testing to see if I was paying attention. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It was nearly 10 p.m., too late for a casual visitor. My first thought was that maybe it was one of the neighbors, but we lived in a pretty quiet area, and most of the houses on our street were spaced far apart. I wasn't expecting anyone. Curious but cautious, I got up and walked to the front door. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated. There was no peephole, and the door was solid wood, so I couldn't see who was outside. I figured it was probably nothing, someone lost or maybe a kid playing a prank, but still, my gut was telling me to be careful. "Who is it?" I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer, just silence. I waited for a moment, listening for any sound, footsteps, rustling leaves, anything. But all I could hear was the faint crackle of the fireplace in the living room behind me. I was about to turn around and walk away when the knock came again, a little louder this time, more insistent. Something about it sent a chill through me. I didn't know why, but suddenly, I didn't want to open the door. The silence on the other side felt too heavy, too deliberate. "Who's there?" I asked again, louder this time, hoping that whoever it was would just announce themselves and put my mind at ease. But again, nothing, just the same eerie quiet. I backed away from the door, my heart beating faster now. I went to the window beside the door and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek out. The porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the front steps, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, the street beyond it deserted. No car, no movement, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I let the curtain fall back into place, feeling a little foolish. It was probably just my imagination running wild, or maybe a prank by some kid from the neighborhood. I tried to shrug it off and went back to the couch, restarting my movie and wrapping the blanket around me a little tighter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every few minutes I found myself glancing at the front door, half expecting to hear another knock. The air in the house felt heavier, the quiet more suffocating. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound, your own breathing, the creak of the floorboards as you shift your weight, the ticking of the clock on the wall. I tried to focus on the movie, but my mind kept drifting back to that knock. What if it hadn't been a prank? What if someone had been outside waiting for me to open the door? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. And then, just as I was starting to calm down, it happened again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was louder, more forceful, like whoever it was wasn't going to leave until I answered. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing. There was no way I was imagining it now. Someone was definitely outside. But when I peeked out the window again, there was still no one there. The porch was empty, the yard as still as before. My stomach twisted with fear. Something wasn't right. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. Should I call the police? Would they even take me seriously if I told them someone was knocking but I couldn't see anyone? I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling, and was about to dial when I heard something that stopped me cold. Footsteps, not on the porch but inside the house. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the hardwood floor behind me. I froze, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps grew louder, closer. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my ears, and saw the front door. It was unlocked. I could have sworn I had locked it earlier, but now it stood slightly ajar, just enough for someone to slip inside. I didn't wait. I bolted for the back door, throwing it open and running into the yard, the cold air biting at my skin. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I looked back, but the house was dark and still, just as it had been before. I called the police from a neighbor's house. When they arrived, they searched the place but found no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been inside. But I know what I heard. I know someone, or something, was in that house with me. I haven't stayed home alone since that night, and every time I hear a knock at the door, no matter how innocent it seems, I can't help but feel that same sense of dread, wondering if it's really just a visitor, or if someone is waiting for me to let them in.